Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 9th week of this Introduction to Phonology at the Ludwig-Maximilians-Universität München. This week, we're going to be dealing more extensively with the interface, the interaction between phonology with the morphological and syntactic modules of the grammar. So in the past several weeks, we've already seen many examples of how morphology plays an important role in helping to find and discover the phonological processes of a grammar, because very often the addition of more morphological material, such as another suffix or prefix, can provide the environment for the application of a rule. Today we'll see some instances in which morphological structure reference to the presence of the distinction between root and stem and morphological word seem to have some effects on the operation of phonological processes. And then we'll further see how reference to syntactic structures may play a role in the operation of phonological rules as well. Then, if we have time, we'll turn to a second larger topic, which isn't covered in the Hayes textbook on variation in phonology. This is mentioned very briefly under the term of optional rules in the Hayes textbook, but isn't discussed extensively. That is, here we'll be looking at instances in which rules may or may not necessarily apply when their conditioning environments are met. Okay, so here are the topics and readings for today, mostly the 10th chapter of Hayes and a small reading that I wrote a few years ago on the topic of variation in phonology. And then next week, we'll move on to a phonological change. The fourth homework assignment will be first uploaded next week, and then of course will be due the following week on the 1st of July. Good, so let's come then to bounding domains. So these so-called bounding domains serve to use either morphological or syntactic information to establish a range in which a phonological process can apply. So thus far, we mostly have always just been looking at segments, and we see if the local segmental contexts, or in the case of a few rules, a non-local segmental context in instances of, say, vowel harmony that we've discussed, if those contexts are met, just looking at the segments, the sounds that we can transcribe using the International Phonetic Alphabet, then the process applies. The idea of a bounding domain, however, is that some processes are more limited or restricted in their application. That is, segments can only be affected by a rule if all of the segments are contained together inside of that domain. So we'll here have domains that can be morphologically defined and some domains that are more syntactically defined. So going from smallest to largest here, we can begin with a root. So normally a word consists minimally of something that we can call a root. It has the core meaningful component. And in some languages where there is a lot of inflectional morphology, where words need to be marked, say, for case and number on nouns, or person and number on verbs, then roots may only be bound. In languages like English or German, we can have a lot of roots that also freely occur as words. So for instance, in English, the word train, describe this, train, or in German, Zug. These would both be instances of roots. We can't further morphologically segment either of these things, but they can then be inflected. And in those cases, when these words are inflected, then they also serve as stems. When they just sit on their own in their singular form, then they have a root, a stem, and are considered a whole morphological word. Some words of English, for instance, like in particular in both English and German, the Latinate lexicon, words that have been borrowed from Latin or ancient Greek, may contain lots of roots which which only occur inside other more morphologically complex words. So for instance, the English root ident, as in the verb identify, or the noun identifier would be such a root that can't stand on its own as an independent word. Similarly, in German, if we take the verb identifizieren, there we can identify a root in here, which would correspond to the English, the same root. It has the same Latinate root in both the English and the German, but it's been extended with other derivational material to make the whole verb. A stem now, in the usual terminology, will mean a morphological unit that consists of a root, at least, and possibly some additional derivational suffixes, that is, some other word formation suffixes. In short, a stem will be everything that you see before the attachment of any inflectional morphology, before any additional inflectional morphemes are added onto a word. So, for instance, if we take the, let's continue to use the English and German words train and Zug as an example here. If we take train in its singular form, there we have the root, and this word also then forms its own stem and has a word boundary as well. So we can see 3 brackets here. This phonological sequence, train, corresponds to the root, the stem, and the word all together. If we build the plural form of this word using the suffix, would be underlying z, so it would be written trains. Let's add a. In that case, since we have an additional inflectional morpheme, train corresponds both to the root and the stem. So we'll copy this part to show that here we have a stem. So here are the first 2 brackets to show that we have this structure, and then the suffix z for marking the morphosyntactic feature of plural is added. And that then the sequence of the root, train, which also corresponds to a stem, would then be built into a whole word with the addition of the inflectional suffix. In building the plural form of German Zug, this gets a bit more complicated because, of course, in making the plural form, there is a conditional application of umlaut on this vowel, so it becomes Züge. So this should be a long vowel here, Zug. And we see our familiar alternation between voiced and voiceless obstruents word finally. But here we can at least clearly see a suffix, g, which marks plural, and this suffix in this case happens to also condition umlaut. We'll ignore this problem, but we would have essentially the same structure as English trains in that case, where here we can replace the sequence train with the sequence Zug. So that will correspond to the stem, and an inflectional suffix is added to give us our entire morphological word. In cases where we add some some further derivational word formational suffixes, then we would have some morphological material intervening between the root and the stem. The root would no longer be identical to the stem in that case. So let's take, for instance, the English word bear, to carry, and its German correspondent, say, tragen. So the root in that, we're giving this in the infinitive. The root here is simply traag. So if we derive an adjective, for instance, with the suffix able, in that case, then our word would contain a root bear, followed by a derivational suffix able. We may transcribe it as something like that in its underlying phonological form. And that builds a stem. And in that case, then, we have no further inflectional material added. So after the stem boundary, we then have the boundary of the morphological word. And similarly, we could derive an adjective with the adjective building suffix ba in German and make an adjective tragbar. And in that case, we would have an identical structure to English bearable. It's just to replace some signs here to tragbar. And there we see to the root trag, the derivational suffix, the word formational suffix ba is added, and thus we generate another stem, and there's no other inflectional material added. If we say had to inflect this adjective for case and number and gender, like a tragbares Hemd, so a wearable shirt, that tends to be a property of shirts, that they are wearable, then in that case one would add a inflectional suffix us, in that case preceding the word Hemd, since it is a neuter noun. And then finally, I've been using the boundary of the unit of word already, and as we've seen already in the cases of the words train and Zug alone, in that case, a root alone was equivalent to the stem and the entire morphological word. And here we have had further cases in the plural forms, trains and Züge, where the entire morphological word, that is a stem with some inflectional material added, had that additional suffix in building up the morphological word. Above the level of the word, then we start looking at syntactic structure and thinking about how syntactic structure maps onto phonological structure. This is a really interesting area of phonological research, which continues to be debated. There are lots of hypotheses in terms of how exactly phonological phrases are built. For our purposes, following Hayes' textbook, we're going to assume that a phonological phrase can easily be syntactically defined. So that is, wherever we have a clear syntactic phrase, where we can define it as some kind of phrase, so a verb phrase or a noun phrase, that's going to correspond to some type of phonological phrase. So for instance, the prepositional phrase in English, in a boat, in that case, we can identify this phrase. We would call it a prepositional phrase because it is headed by this preposition in, and that's going to correspond to a phonological phrase. We can see far deeper within there that there could also be, depending on, we'll call this a noun phrase, assuming that it's headed by the noun boat here in simple terms. And there we might assume that we have some recursive phonological phrases, or maybe the phonological phrase boundary that could be built by noun phrase is done away with here in English. As you can see, this gets rather complicated fairly easily. We'll work out one fairly straightforward, simple example from the language Chinguini, taken from your textbook at the end of this lecture, where we can simply divide up a phrase concretely into a noun phrase and a verb phrase, and that establishes some clear boundaries. Now, and lastly, the other level of phrasing that we'll talk about here is finally the utterance. And by an utterance, we simply mean a sequence of multiple words that ignores syntactic constituency. So it doesn't matter whether there are any syntactic phrase boundaries between the words, but really just if there are pauses. So we can think of this as sort of a whole, the difference between phrases within a whole sentence and separate sentences that will be broken up by pauses. So some phonological processes may only, and indeed a lot of phonological processes, tend to apply only within a word. Some more restricted phonological processes may be limited to applying inside a stem or a root. Then we can find some phonological processes that apply within a phrase and the lower units. And finally, there are some few phonological processes. We'll see one example in a few minutes, in which it doesn't matter if there are any of these other boundaries. The word simply looks to see if the segmental context necessary for its application is there, and then it applies. So as we see, these so-called bounding domains can be both larger or smaller than the word. Thus far in this course, we've concentrated at the word level because that's where a lot of phonology tends to take place. A lot of the processes that are most clearly identifiable are bounded by the word, but not all of them. Some are bounded by larger units of phrases and utterances, and some are bounded by smaller units like stems or roots. The overall principle that we'll see illustrated in just a minute is that when a rule scans an input, that is when it looks at a sequence of sounds, and it finds a sequence of sounds that would allow for the application of the process, then the process is only able to apply if all of the segments are contained within that domain. So as a simple example, let's imagine that we have a rule that transforms an underlying coronal stop into a voiced coronal stop if it is followed by a nasal segment. So this would be an example of so-called post-nasal voicing. In this case, we restricted it to an alveolar consonant. And when we invent a language here, let's say that this process turns out to be restricted to applying at the level of a stem. So we can mark this as a stem-bounded rule. So if we say that this process is stem-bounded, let's imagine that a language has a stem keet and an inflection, a stem keen and an inflectional suffix ta. So let's say that keen means goat, and ta is an inflectional suffix. And ta is an inflectional suffix meaning plural. So in this case, if we have this, this can't be further segmented, but keen can be directly inflected. So it can be a case of a root, which can also be a stem. And if ta is an inflectional suffix, and we know that this process is stem bounded, will the process apply in this case? The answer will be no, because as you can see, the syntactic, the internal structure will be a root keen, which is also equivalent to a stem. And then we have this ta following. So from the purely phonological information, without these, this additional morphological structure, it would look like this rule of postnasal voicing could apply because the voiceless alveolar stop follows a nasal segment here. But because this stop is not contained within the stem together with the nasal, the process is not able to apply. So in this instance, postnasal voicing cannot apply. And so from the input keen Ta, in this case, the output would be hinta without application of postnasal voicing. All right, now that we've introduced these morphological and syntactic structures, let's take a short break before we come to look at a series of some English examples which illustrate these different levels of boundaries in more detail.